The Wheeler family had always been the picture of success in the quiet town of Millersfield. Mark Wheeler was a respected businessman, known for his integrity and charm. He had built a successful company from the ground up, providing for his family in ways many could only dream of. His daughter Emily was a bright and ambitious 16-year-old. She had a promising future ahead of her, excelling in her studies and always the center of attention at school events. To the outside world, the Wheelers were the perfect family, a symbol of stability and happiness. But appearances can be deceiving. In the comfort of their home, things were far from perfect. As time went on, a coldness began to develop between father and daughter. Emily, who had once been her father's pride and joy, seemed to withdraw more and more into herself. She stopped confiding in him and began spending more time alone in her room. Mark, who had always been a hands-on parent, tried to reach out, but his efforts were met with increasing resistance. The once warm and loving relationship between them had started to crumble, and neither of them knew how to fix it. The root of their growing distance was difficult to pinpoint at first. Mark chalked it up to Emily going through a rebellious phase, something he thought was natural for a teenager. He would often remind her how important it was for her to focus on her future and stay on the right path. But Emily, who had once been eager to please, began to push him away. She became distant, avoiding family dinners and spending hours on her phone or in front of her computer. Mark, too caught up in the demands of his business, didn't realize how deeply troubled his daughter had become. What Mark didn't know was that Emily's life had started to unravel in ways he couldn't have imagined. She had recently discovered the truth about her father's financial troubles. Mark's business, once thriving, had started to decline. The reality of his failing investments and the mounting debts had begun to take its toll. He had been working tirelessly to keep everything afloat, hiding the truth from his family. But Emily had become aware of the cracks in their once perfect world. She had overheard him on the phone late at night, arguing with creditors and desperate to come up with a solution. It was a side of her father she had never seen before, the vulnerable, desperate side. It scared her. She had always seen him as a strong, invincible figure, but now she realized that her father wasn't the man she thought he was. As the weeks went by, Emily began to feel trapped. She had always been proud of her father's success, but now the pressure of his failure weighed heavily on her. She had learned that he was involved in some dangerous dealings, trying to keep his company afloat by making promises he couldn't keep. Emily's resentment grew as she saw the strain on her father's face and heard the whispered conversations late at night. She couldn't shake the feeling that her father had been hiding something from her for years. And then there was the matter of the boarding school. Mark, in an attempt to give Emily a fresh start and distance her from the toxic environment at home, had been planning to send her away to an exclusive boarding school. He believed it would be good for her, a chance for her to focus on her studies and escape the pressures of their failing family dynamic. Emily, however, saw it as a betrayal. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of their already fragile relationship. Mark wasn't just cutting her off from his life, he was cutting her off from her home, from everything she had ever known. This betrayal, real or perceived, pushed Emily to the breaking point. She started to resent her father's attempts to control her life. The boarding school seemed like the ultimate betrayal, a decision that would separate them forever. She couldn't stand the idea of being sent away, alone, while her father carried on with his troubled life. The love she had once felt for him turned to anger, and that anger turned to something darker. It wasn't long before Emily began to plan. She would make sure that her future was no longer in her father's hands. It would be a future that she could control, one where she wouldn't have to live in the shadow of her father's mistakes. The stage was set, and no one, least of all Mark, could have seen it coming. The perfect family was about to be torn apart in the most unimaginable way. The morning of Mark Wheeler's death was like any other. The sun was just beginning to rise over the small town of Millersfield, casting a soft glow on the houses and streets. It seemed as though nothing could disrupt the calm of the quiet neighborhood. But in the Wheeler household, things were far from peaceful. The discovery of Mark's lifeless body would soon shake the entire town to its core. When Detective Miller and Detective Harlow arrived at the scene, the house seemed eerily quiet. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, and no signs of a struggle. Everything was in place, as if nothing had been disturbed. But the lifeless body of Mark Wheeler, found in his study, told a different story. He was slumped in his chair, his eyes wide open, staring at the desk in front of him. His expression was frozen in a look of disbelief, as though he had seen something or someone he hadn't expected. The initial impression was that of an ordinary crime scene. It appeared as though Mark had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong. His expensive watch, his wallet, and his laptop were all still present in the room untouched. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks or doors. It was almost as if the killer had walked right in, taken care of the victim, and left without a trace. Detective Miller stood in the doorway of the study, his mind racing as he surveyed the scene. The lack of a struggle was puzzling. Mark's body showed no obvious signs of injury, no bruises, no cuts, nothing that would explain how he had died. It was as if his life had been taken in an instant, and yet there were no weapons in sight. The detectives began their investigation by speaking to the household staff. Mark's wife, who was out of town on a business trip, had no idea what had happened. She was just as shocked as anyone else when she heard the news. The housekeeper, who had worked for the family for years, said that everything had seemed normal the night before. Mark had been in good spirits, working late in his study, but there had been no unusual activity. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious. The only person who had been in the house that night, aside from the staff, was Emily. Emily's behavior was immediately suspicious. She had been in her room for most of the night, according to the staff, but when Detective Miller spoke to her, her demeanor seemed off. She was quiet, distant, and reluctant to engage in conversation. She told the detectives that she had heard nothing during the night, but her story seemed rehearsed, as if she were trying to avoid any suspicion. Despite her calm exterior, something about Emily's response didn't sit right with Detective Miller. Her father had been found dead in his study, and yet she seemed more concerned with the logistics of her day rather than the tragedy that had unfolded in her own home. Her behavior was unlike that of someone who had just lost a parent. The detectives began to piece together the details of Mark's life, hoping to find any clue that would explain why someone would want to kill him. They learned that Mark had been under an immense amount of stress in recent months. His business was facing financial difficulties, and he had been spending long hours working to keep things afloat. He had been worried about his company's future, but no one knew just how dire the situation had become. Emily, however, had a different perspective. She had been growing increasingly frustrated with her father's secrecy. She had noticed the change in him, the late-night phone calls, the hushed conversations in his office. She had overheard snippets of conversations about debts, threats, and promises that her father couldn't keep. The tension in the house had become unbearable, and Emily, feeling trapped and confused, had no one to turn to. As the investigation progressed, the detectives discovered that Mark had been hiding his financial troubles from his family. The business he had built with so much pride was on the verge of collapse. Emily, however, had become aware of it, and the weight of that knowledge was eating away at her. But was that enough to drive her to murder? Was her father's financial failure the motive behind his death, or was there something deeper at play? The more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Was Mark's death a result of his own mistakes, or was someone in his own family responsible? Detective Miller's instincts told him that the truth was much darker than it appeared, and he was determined to uncover what had really happened in the Wheeler household. But the deeper he dug, the more the line between family loyalty and betrayal began to blur. As the investigation into Mark Wheeler's death deepened, the detectives started to uncover unsettling truths that painted a very different picture of the man everyone had believed him to be. On the surface, Mark had been a successful businessman, well-liked, respected, and admired by his peers. But as the detectives sifted through his personal life, they began to see a different side of him, a side that had been carefully hidden from the public eye. The first shock came when they discovered that Mark's company had been in serious financial trouble for quite some time. His business empire, which seemed to be thriving on the outside, had been struggling with mounting debts and poor investments. Mark had been using deceptive accounting practices to cover up the true state of his finances. What appeared to be a booming business was, in reality, a house of cards built on lies. He had borrowed money from shady investors, promising them huge returns, but in reality, he had no way of repaying the loans. The detectives soon learned that Mark had become entangled with dangerous people, criminals, and unscrupulous businessmen who had been pushing him to the brink. He had been trying to juggle his failing business while keeping the truth hidden from his family. He believed that if Emily and his wife, Sarah, found out the truth, it would destroy them. So he kept his financial struggles a secret, even as the pressure mounted. But the hidden world of deceit and financial ruin wasn't the only secret Mark had been keeping. The more the detectives dug, the more they uncovered about the darker side of his personal life. Mark had been involved in a series of unethical business deals, some of which crossed the line into criminal territory. He had been using his influence to push through questionable contracts, bribe officials, and make backdoor deals that had left a trail of enemies in his wake. Emily, though only a teenager, had started to notice these changes. She had seen the late-night phone calls, the visits from strangers, and the way her father had become increasingly secretive. The father she had once looked up to as a strong, honorable man was now someone she barely recognized. As Emily grew older, she began to understand more about her father's business dealings and the extent of his financial troubles. She overheard him arguing with creditors on the phone, threatening her with boarding school and a future she didn't want. Emily's resentment toward her father grew. She felt betrayed not only by his lies but by the way he was allowing their family to fall apart. But it wasn't just the financial strain that had caused a rift between father and daughter. Emily also discovered a personal betrayal that cut even deeper. Mark had been planning to send her away to an exclusive boarding school in another state, a decision he had made without consulting her. The idea of being sent away from the only family she had left, felt like abandonment to Emily. It was the final blow in a long line of disappointments. The boarding school was not just a place for her to get an education, it was Mark's way of cutting her out of his life. This, Emily thought, was the ultimate betrayal. Her father had always been distant in recent months, but now it seemed he had made the decision to sever ties completely. The thought of being separated from him, of losing her connection to the only family she had left, drove her into a deep sense of hopelessness and anger. She began to feel isolated, as though the world around her was crumbling, and the only way out was to take control of her own future. The frustration built inside her, fueling a dark plan she had been quietly constructing for weeks. Emily's anger was not just directed at her father's financial failures or the boarding school. She felt trapped in a life she couldn't control, a life where she was at the mercy of her father's decisions. And as she began to understand the true scope of Mark's dealings, she saw an opportunity to regain control, to secure her future, and to escape the crumbling world her father had created. The once adored daughter of a successful businessman was now planning something far darker than anyone could imagine. The detectives continued their investigation, unaware of the true depth of Emily's involvement. They were beginning to understand the financial pressures Mark had faced, but they had no idea that the seemingly sweet teenager had been silently plotting her father's demise. As they uncovered more details of his life, they unknowingly closed in on the very person who had orchestrated the crime. But there was one final, chilling piece of the puzzle that neither they nor anyone else could have foreseen. Emily wasn't acting alone. The investigation into Mark Wheeler's death took a startling turn when Detective Miller and Detective Harlow unearthed a hidden journal tucked away in a drawer in Mark's study. The journal, which appeared to be a personal account of his thoughts and experiences, was a disturbing revelation. It was filled with fragmented entries, written in a hurried and disjointed manner, as though Mark had been trying to make sense of the chaos consuming his life. At first, the entries seemed relatively mundane, nothing more than a businessman's reflections on the stresses of running a company. But as the detectives flipped through the pages, a darker pattern began to emerge. In several entries, Mark spoke about feeling trapped in a web of lies and the pressure of his failing business. There were mentions of threatening phone calls, shadowy figures lurking in the background, and a growing sense of paranoia that Mark could no longer escape. It was clear that he had been under immense stress, but the most unsettling parts of the journal were the entries that mentioned his daughter, Emily. In one entry, Mark wrote about Emily's growing distance from him and the way she had started to ask probing questions about the family's finances. He expressed frustration at her inability to understand the reality of the situation. He wrote, "She doesn't know what I'm protecting her from. She thinks I'm just failing her, but I'm trying to shield her from the consequences of my choices. She doesn't understand the world I've gotten us into." The entries only grew more troubling as the days passed. Mark mentioned a plan to send Emily away to boarding school, thinking it would be the best thing for her. But in his writing, it became evident that this decision had been met with resistance. Emily had become more withdrawn, and Mark had begun to suspect that she was not as unaware of the family's problems as he had hoped. One entry read, "She's starting to figure things out. I can see it in her eyes. She's angry and I don't know how to fix it. I'm losing her, and I don't know what to do." But what really caught the detective's attention were the final entries. Mark's writing became increasingly erratic and desperate. He spoke of a final plan and how he was trying to protect his daughter from the consequences of his mistakes. It seemed as though he feared someone was going to hurt her, someone who was already closing in on him. There were references to people from his past, dangerous individuals who had been after him for months. The last few pages of the journal mentioned that Mark was certain someone was plotting against him. He didn't know who it was, but he suspected that Emily might be involved. The detectives were stunned by this revelation. Could it be possible that Mark, in his paranoia and desperation, had known about the plot on his life? Did he suspect that his own daughter, the one person he had been trying to protect, was involved in his death? The journal seemed to suggest this, but it was far from clear. The more the detectives read, the more questions arose. As they dug deeper into Mark's personal life, they discovered something even more chilling. They found evidence of strange meetings between Mark and Robert, a longtime family friend who had always been considered trustworthy. Robert had been a fixture in the Wheeler family's life, someone who had been there during the highs and lows, and who had even helped Mark with some of his business ventures. But when the detectives examined Robert's recent interactions with Mark, they found something odd. Robert had been involved in some of the shady business dealings that had begun to unravel Mark's life. He had been helping Mark cover up some of the more questionable financial decisions, and there were rumors that Robert had been acting in his own interests, manipulating situations to benefit himself. What was even more disturbing was the connection between Robert and Emily. Emily had been seen with Robert on several occasions in the weeks leading up to her father's death. They had been meeting in secret, though no one knew exactly what they were discussing. It was clear that Robert had a far more significant role in this tragedy than anyone had realized. As the detectives continued to investigate, they began to suspect that the murder wasn't just the result of Emily's anger toward her father, but rather the culmination of a much more complex and sinister plan. Emily, who had been grappling with her father's secrets, had become a pawn in a much larger game, one that had been orchestrated by Robert. The more the detectives uncovered, the more they realized that the truth behind Mark Wheeler's death was not as simple as a daughter's resentment toward her father. There was a far darker force at play, and the detectives were just beginning to scratch the surface. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, the shocking truth about Mark Wheeler's death began to emerge, revealing a chilling web of betrayal, manipulation, and deception that no one had expected. Detective Miller and Detective Harlow were on the verge of uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy, but the final revelation would leave them and the entire town reeling in disbelief. The detectives focused on Robert, the family friend who had been a constant presence in the Wheeler household. He had been more than just a friend to Mark. He had been a trusted confidant, someone who had helped Mark during his most difficult times. But the more they dug into Robert's past, the clearer it became that he had been playing a much darker role in the family's tragedy. They discovered that Robert had been deeply involved in Mark's financial troubles, and his motives were far more sinister than anyone had realized. Robert had been using Mark's failing business to his advantage, positioning himself to take over the company when it eventually collapsed. He had been orchestrating deals behind the scenes, manipulating Mark into making decisions that would benefit him financially. As Mark's debts mounted, Robert had seen an opportunity to take control, and he had started to make moves to ensure that he would be the one to emerge as the victor when the dust settled. But he knew that Mark would never willingly give up his company or step aside, and that's when Robert began to plot his ultimate betrayal. The detectives uncovered evidence that Robert had been working with Emily, exploiting her anger and resentment toward her father. Emily had been isolated, feeling abandoned by Mark, who had kept so many secrets from her. She had already discovered her father's financial troubles, but Robert had given her something more, an opportunity to regain control of her life. He had promised her that if they could take out Mark, she would inherit everything, including her father's company and wealth. Robert had carefully planted the idea in Emily's mind, preying on her feelings of anger and betrayal. He knew that Emily's desperation would make her the perfect accomplice. Robert's influence over Emily had grown in the weeks leading up to her father's death. They had been meeting in secret, discussing their plans and strategies. Emily, still reeling from her father's betrayal and his decision to send her away to boarding school, had become more susceptible to Robert's manipulation. She had seen him as a father figure, someone who understood her pain and frustrations. In Robert's eyes, Emily was a means to an end, a pawn in his larger scheme to take control of Mark's business. The night of Mark's death had been the culmination of months of careful planning. Emily had lured her father into his study under the pretense of talking about the future. She had promised him that she would accept his decision about the boarding school, but in reality she had a different agenda. As Mark sat at his desk, distracted and weary from the stress of his failing business, Emily had slipped something into his drink, a powerful sedative that would knock him out cold. It was the perfect opportunity. Robert, who had been waiting in the shadows, had entered the room quietly and finished the job. Mark, drugged and unaware of what was happening, had never stood a chance. He had been suffocated, a clean and silent death, leaving behind no trace of a struggle. When Mark's body was discovered, the investigation seemed to point in one direction: a robbery gone wrong. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious motives. But the detectives were beginning to piece together the true story. They had initially suspected Emily, and now it seemed their suspicions were correct, but with a twist they hadn't expected. Emily had been the one to carry out the murder, but she hadn't done it alone. Robert had been the mastermind, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. As the detectives confronted Emily with the evidence they had gathered, she broke down. The weight of the truth, the realization that she had been manipulated into committing such a heinous act, was too much for her to bear. She confessed to everything: how Robert had convinced her that her father's betrayal had to be avenged, how he had promised her the world in return for her loyalty. But in the end she had been nothing more than a pawn in Robert's game, a pawn whose actions had led to the destruction of her family. The final arrest was made, and Robert was taken into custody. He had never expected Emily to turn on him, but in the end, his greed and manipulation had led to his own downfall. The town of Millersfield was left in shock, struggling to comprehend the events that had transpired within the seemingly perfect Wheeler family. Mark Wheeler, a successful businessman, had been betrayed by the very people he trusted most: his daughter and his closest friend. The crime had been meticulously planned, but in the end it was the truth that had come out, exposing the darkness lurking beneath the surface of the Wheeler family's perfect life. The case had been solved, but the scars left behind would never heal. The town of Millersfield would forever remember the horrifying case of a father, a daughter, and the shocking planning that had led to a tragedy no one could have anticipated.